Okay, so yeah, thank you so much again for taking the time. I'm not exaggerating one bit when I'm saying that this is probably the most excited I've been for an interview in years.
Good.
I've been thinking about our conversation since the first time, you agreed to it. The fact of the matter is that, in the last year or so, I've been so much into, astrophysics and just the interconnection between the science and, and the idea about the human existence and how all of this connects to, how all connects together. And I came across your lectures, which very much touched on topics that I've been so fascinated by in terms of, especially my most favorite one was what's outside of the universe. And, I guess we'll go into that. But first, I'm very interested to hear how, because with this sort of conversations, obviously it's a standard to start with some introductions and to lay some groundwork. But in this case, I would be very much interested to hear how would you introduce yourself and what do you want people to perceive you as in terms of first impression when you are getting the opportunity to meet new people?
Well, I guess I would say that, my name is James, and I'm a particle physicist here at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. I'm coming to you from lovely CERN, but it's just an office, so it's not really going to be so eye-popping at the moment. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess, yes, I'm a particle physicist, but that's sort of one aspect of what I'm interested in. Just like everybody else, every other human, I'm a multifaceted person. And this, I kind of think of the Large Hadron Collider as unique as it is, and as kind of groundbreaking and eye-popping and mind-blowing as it is. It's sort of my day job. I have lots of other projects that I try to fit into my off hours, so to speak. And so, as you mentioned, I'd like to do these kind of like on stage monologues, these sort of science storytelling monologues. These are a lot of fun. I also, in fact, I'm a filmmaker too. I have a background in the arts and have lots of artist friends, and I host a lot of artist friends and collaborate with them in various places, including here at CERN and around the world. But yeah, I mean, I also do a lot of other things like anybody else. My path to where I am today is, which is a very unique place, I admit. And the kind of research that we do here is very unique as well. But my path here is not the kind of straightforward path that a lot of scientists take. I mean, it's funny because a lot of, it's a huge place. So CERN, I don't know, for those of you that don't know, those who might be listening that don't know, CERN is a rather large laboratory. It's a host laboratory for physics projects, and it doesn't really own anything. It hosts them. So I work on site here with, I don't know, 6 or 7,000 people per day that come on site, and several thousand of the other people around the globe that are still working on this research, because the physical projects might be based here, the experiments, the colliders and various things like that, but the people working on them are all around the globe. And so, there's a lot of people that come here, and, the vast majority, I think, of people that work at this kind of research, they take a sort of straightforward academic path, right? Where you start from, as a child, you think science is interesting, and then you get someone tells you you're good at math. And I think that as an aside note, I think that everybody is potentially good at math. There's no such thing as a person who is naturally good or naturally bad at math. I think it's more a matter of trying to figure out where the sort of this culturally constructed math phobia was introduced somewhere in somebody's life. And then they go, the typical physicist does these things, and then they're good in high school, and they do like the physics classes, and they like it, and then they get to university and they do the same thing, and then maybe they do a PhD in physics, and then they, and all around, along the way, they've started to work on projects that are based here, and then they get to become a grad student, and maybe they're based here for a few years, and then they become a postdoc and they're based here, and so that's the kind of normal route. When I got to university the first time, I was like, oh, I'm going to art school. So I have a background in film. I went to art school for film. And again, not as an intent. My intention was never to, move to Hollywood and become production assistant and work my way up to unit production manager. That was never my intention. I was not really interested in Hollywood style films, but more interested in film as cinema as an art form, as a means of exploring complex ideas. And so after I did that, though, and I never, I was also obsessed with physics and math. I always had been, and especially in high school. But then afterwards, I realized that I was still doing myself a disservice if I didn't study physics and math formally. So I went back to school and I got a completely separate second bachelor's degree in a double major in physics and math. And everybody looked at me like I was a crazy person because that's not that typical in the United States. And then so I did that anyway, and then I went to graduate school for my doctorate in New York at New York University, and along the way got involved in this kind of research, and then I got a postdoc position based here at CERN, and so here I am, and I've been here for several years now. And so my path to get here was a bit strange, but I think it's it's interesting because it allows some other kinds of perspectives to seep into the research rather than just the kind of standard academic path. So yeah, I don't know. It's hard to, as you can tell, it's hard to put into one sentence what I am, what I would think that I am, and I think that should be true for every single human being. But for me, definitely. So
yeah, it's something that really impressed me during our first conversation where we discussed your feature on the podcast was that as you've mentioned, you're a filmmaker and you have passion for art. So I'm very interested to hear, through your childhood or through your early years, how did, your passion and fascination develop in terms of both science and in films? Because it's very rare to meet people who are equally interested in the empirical and the science aspect of life. It's usually this sort of of a stigma where you either can be a very analytical person or a very emotional person, and you sort of either go to one of the directions. And it's very rare to meet people who are equally interested in both paths. So I'm very interested to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that in fact you will run across several people in physics, especially in physics, particle physics, astrophysics, physics, that have a long-standing, and in sciences in general, have a long-standing interest in art as well. Maybe they don't have an artistic practice, but some do, either for relaxation or for as a hobby or something like that. And so I don't know. I mean, for me, as a child, I was always just kind of, I was one of these kids that was always drawn to the sort of like edges of our human knowledge, the sort of like how far can we push things until they break? How far can we go until we don't understand something anymore? So, I like to say that no one really chooses to be a physicist. Physics chooses you, because that's the place where you find yourself if you're that kind of kid where you never accept, that's just the way it is as an answer. Like if you ask ask your dad, why is the sky blue? And your dad just says, well, that's just the way it is. Some kids just roll their eyes and then go read comic books and never think about it again. But the physicist is the one who said, that's not satisfying. I need to know the answer. And so they ask somebody else. And if nobody has the answer, then you go to the library. So I was a big library guy, and I always have been. And I would go there to find my answers to multiple things. And it was interesting because every time you find an answer to something, the question you had, it opens up about 10 more questions that you didn't know you had. And those are equally fascinating. So this is the kind of thing where, science as a human pursuit, right, there's nothing magic about it. There's nothing sort of, there's nothing kind of like unnatural or like, special in a sense. But there is, I mean, it is a special set of tools, but it's nothing magic. It's simply the best way that humans have, the only way that we have, in fact, to separate truth from falsehood to any reasonable degree, to any kind of reasonably reliable degree. And so once you recognize that as a child or as an adult, you realize that science is amazing. And again, science is not a list of facts. It's a process. It's a process by which we ask and answer questions about the world around us to a reliable, to get to reliable conclusions about the world around us. So that's pretty much it. And so when you think of it that way, it's not that, the desire to answer these questions, I admit that there are certain people who I still think that deep down inside, everybody is secretly a particle physicist because of the thing we're talking about here. But I think that, there are some people that for whatever reason, maybe acculturated, maybe natural, whatever, they don't, they don't really like to dig deeply down to the underpinnings of everything. But there are those people that are kind of naturally drawn to those kinds of questions. But if you think about the desire to even ask and answer such questions, like, what's outside the universe, or, how small can I cut anything, which is basically what we try to, the question we ask here at CERN and various places around the world, that the desire to ask those questions, or the urge to ask those questions, comes from a gap. It comes from a separation. And the separation is between what I currently right now understand about the world, and what I think that my understanding is, quote unquote, and then some new observation that I make that doesn't fit with that, right? And so when you have that's where curiosity comes in. You're like, well, wait a minute. So, think back way back in the day, when people were like, oh, well, I've been, every night I come out here and I see these white dots on the sky kind of moving in different directions, and then suddenly I start to see one like that I've been tracing for months, and it does this strange thing where it kind of goes around. The rest of them go in this kind of flat in this straight direction, but this one has been doing this strange thing. I wonder why that is, right? Because for me, I mean, maybe my village elders told me that these were, the stars were, there was a solid dome of sky above, and maybe they were painted on this dome, but that wouldn't make any sense if it was just a dome that was moving, and that would make that one of them wouldn't do this weird curly Q thing compared to the others. That doesn't make any sense. So that's where, again, I've been told one thing. I have one set of understanding. I have a new observation. That gap is where curiosity comes in. And in fact, you can think of art as a kind of similar thing. The desire to do art for a lot of artists, at least my favorite artists, the ones that are really driven, is because they have a similar experience, right? Is that you have, some current understanding of the universe, and whatever that means, like psychology, politics, society, whatever, interpersonal relationships, grieving, happiness, things like this. And then some new thing comes along, some new experience, some new sensation, some new idea. It doesn't fit with what I currently understand, and that creates this gap. It creates this separation. And so the artist is like inextricably drawn to that gap. Like, that's fascinating. Why is this? So I think of the, science and art are as two different modes of human inquiry, if you will. There are two different ways by which humans, try to dig into this gap between known and unknown. And of course, the outcomes of these two different modes of inquiry, right, very different, right? I mean, scientific papers and robust conclusions about the universe versus, the different, impressionistic or expressionistic pieces of art and things like that. And of course, we judge the outcomes very differently, right? I mean, it would make no sense if the entire artistic community got together and wrote a document that said, we have determined that there is only one correct way to appreciate a Joan Miro painting, right? That would be insane. But that's what we do with science, right? It's like, okay, we look through all this data, and this is the best conclusion that we have based upon this data, right? So again, we judge the outcomes differently, but I think that for a lot of scientists, the fire in the belly that comes to do either science or art, or for a lot of either scientists or artists, this fire in the belly comes from a similar place. It's a kind of curiosity. So I don't know. I think that a lot of scientists do secretly have that. They have, and again, sometimes not even secretly, explicitly. There's a lot of scientists that do some art stuff on the side, or they maybe have a side gig in the arts too. Yeah. And I think that, over the years that I've met so many other artists that are fascinated by science as well, I think that, that's another piece of evidence that these kinds of disciplines, if you will, are connected, at least back at the fire in the belly or the fire in the heart to do them perspective.
I think, that's such an accurate way to put it, because I've always been a very big supporter of this idea that, it's just different means to one end. It's just a different way of the human mind to perceive and to obviously operate and function in the way it's supposed to be. And I very much relate to, what you've mentioned in terms of the human mind being very much driven to understand what can be perceived. I think this is the notion and this is the concept that driven me to this whole field. So I'm interested to hear, do you remember like the first thing that you encounter in terms of this sort of a mystery or this sort of a, of a happening that made you so fascinated in that, give you the idea in terms of the field that you want to develop yourself in terms of, whether it's physics, whether it's maths? Do you remember the first thing that happened and you were like, wow, I really want to understand how is this happening? And I'm really interested in this whole dynamic.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I can remember the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
And if there was a first thing, of course there had to have been. I don't remember exactly what that was,
Mm-hmm.
but I do remember many things that, as a child, things that would come up, like this one, why is the sky blue? And the first people that were around me didn't really have good answers, or they gave me answers that didn't seem so satisfying. And I'm like, and it's also interesting. It's an interesting dynamic because I grew up in a rather extremely religious, sort of like almost like culty religious perspective community, and in society. And that was, I realized in fact pretty early on in my life that I was an atheist, but not when I was like 5 years old. And these things still seemed weird to me at like 8 years old, when somebody would say, oh, well, a deity did that, God did that. It's like, well, that was completely unsatisfying to me. And it was only later when I realized that, that I'd been raised in this kind of like high pressure, weird cult environment, that I started to come to terms with, the differences in the way that, the difference between trying to get to an answer and it's okay to not know something and then seek after the answer, versus this is the way things are and don't question them. That was only later when I realized that there was such a powerful way of thinking about the world, and found my own kind of, deep, true perspective instead. And so there were a lot of things like that. And again, I'm not saying that every question that I had about science was answered with God did it, but I was confronted with quite a few sort of capitulations like that, or sort of throwing up their hands. It's like, well, I don't know, but that's beyond our understanding. No, lots of things. Nothing's beyond our understanding. And it's interesting too, because a lot of the discord or the dissonance that happens is that people within religious traditions, and again, it's none of my business what somebody else wants to believe, as long as they're not hurting anybody else with their belief system. It's fine. It's none of my business. But you do have a lot of these people that they love to insist that certain things are true in the face of absolutely no evidence for that thing. And in fact, it's one of the big differences between a sort of religious mindset toward the world and a scientific mindset. Like, because a lot of people will also, defame the sciences. And again, we're getting into sort of a side topic here, but a lot of people within very dogmatic traditions, and it doesn't have to be religious. It can just be like very, very sort of like old fashioned conservative mindsets. They denigrate science as a concept because they like to say, oh, well, science is just another form of religion. You just have to believe. You're just believing that's true, man. It's like, you've never seen the Higgs boson, man. You're just believing it's true. That is completely wrong. It's like so wrong that it's hard to put into words, because science has absolutely nothing to do with belief. It doesn't, because anytime you posit belief, you're built into the concept of belief as a choice. I can choose to believe something, right? And that's the concept of belief, right? It's like if you see two people outside of a church, right? And one of them says, like, well, I believe God is there's a bearded white man that lives outside the universe that looks at you. And the other person says, well, I don't believe that. They both have a choice, right? They choose to believe that. The other person's like, well, I choose not to believe you. But with data, with science, you don't have a choice. Seriously, there's nothing to choose, because we have, again, this is also a very interesting thing. I use my own field as an example, but it applies to all the sciences. When we discovered this particle, the Higgs boson particle, in 2012, hooray, good for me and my colleagues. Like, I don't know, 6,000 people discovered the Higgs boson, so it's not as impressive as it sounds. But it is impressive in another way. So because of that community discovery. But when we published the paper, right, the thing we said was not, we believe we've discovered the Higgs boson. Instead, what we said is, we see an effect in our data that is inconsistent with the absence of a new discovery. Therefore, we conclude that we have seen something new that has not been, we have observed something new that has not been seen before. There's nothing to disagree with there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we, like, as you know, with science, the whole point is that you put in all of your uncertainties, you label them, you make sure you understand them. And if you don't understand your uncertainties, you don't publish the paper. And once everything is out there, that's it. The data are the data, full stop. There's nothing to either believe in or disbelieve. And you never assent to something in science. You never assent to the truth of something in the absence of evidence for it. That would make no sense. It's the opposite of what science does. But that's, if you think about it, that's exactly what religious traditions require of you, at least major religious traditions, right? They require this concept of faith, right? And you are necessarily required to believe, to assent to the reality of some claim deliberately in the absence of evidence for it, because that's where faith comes in. Because if you had evidence, you wouldn't need faith. So that's where that's why these two things are. It's propagandistic for people to say, oh, well, science is just another form of religion. It couldn't be farther from the truth. So this is the long way of saying that, there were a lot of things when I was growing up that would fall into that basket of things. People would just sort of try to evade the answer. But, of course, we had, it was the modern age. I had libraries, I had places I could go for real information, and I had real science teachers and things like that. It's, I don't want to give the impression that I was, raised in like on the moon or something like that, where there was no access to anything. So that's what I would do. I would seek out these things on myself. I really was that crazy kid who would like go to the library and like spend hours looking through the encyclopedia and finding other weird books and comparing things. And specific things, no. I do remember though as a kid, and it's kind of a funny thing related to what I do now, right? Because here at CERN, at particle physics in general, as a discipline, really what we're trying to do is study how the smallest possible things in the universe construct the universe itself. Right. So that's really what we're doing. We're trying to understand what are the smallest, most elementary things that the universe has in store for us, in the building blocks, and how do those come together in various ways through interactions and forces, et cetera, to lead to the universe that we observe now and that we live in. And so I remember as a kid, I think like any of us, but I remember, playing with my bread or food as a tiny child. And it was like trying to think about how small could I go. I thought it was so weird that you start with the bread. It was just one moment that kind of like hit me, where I was like a baby, and then I got into like a toddler and then an adult. I was like it's bread, but then I can cut it down to a crumb. And then how small? What's the smallest crumb? Mom, what's the smallest crumb? And she's like, oh, well, if you get small enough, there's something called molecules. And that was way over my head, right? It was too small. But I was like, oh, molecules or something, so this is one of these things where, again, I say that physics chooses you. You don't really choose physics, because and then once I got older, get into the sciences, get into classes, right? Of course, you start learning science, proper science. And again, I actually went to public schools. Don't worry, I wasn't actually, like I said, I wasn't raised in like a religious cult on the moon or something like that. I went to real schools, but they start teaching the different sciences, right? And I was fascinated by all the sciences, and of course, I was fascinated by the art schools as well, or the art classes as well. But like all the sciences are amazing, and so geology, incredible. I loved everything about it. Archaeology, who doesn't love that? Marine biology, everybody loves marine biology. I was fascinated by all these different things, but the physicist is always the one who asks the question the how and why question behind the how and why, and you want to get deeper and deeper and deeper. So if you're like, if you're a zoologist, you learn about, or a biologist, you learn about, human biology or just animal, biology in general. You're like, wow, this is fascinating. I got to study this for the rest of my life. And that's great. And then if you're, but if you're the physicist, you're like, what's below that? What's underneath biology? And eventually you'll get down and say, okay, well, there's like genomics, and there's like, but what's below that? It's like, okay, well, you get down into chemistry. Chemistry is this, how these things fit together and the different patterns that they make these effects and these kinds of things. And that's great. But the physicist goes, okay, but what's below that? Because it's like, well, okay, these molecules are made up of different atoms, and the atoms have protons and electrons. It's like, what's below? What's smaller than an electron? And the answer is, we don't know. We think an electron has zero volume. That's where I want to be, right? I want to be right at the edge. And then you ask, like, can I cut a proton? And it turns out we can actually cut what's inside of a proton. There's little quarks and gluons inside there. And then you ask, can I cut a quark? The answer is, as far as we know, no. This is also a zero volume thing. And that's exactly where I want to be, because these are the big questions. Another thing that these are the kind of edges of human knowledge, right? Another one that was always interesting to me was, of course, black holes. I mean, black holes blew my mind when I was a small kid, reading these science books that would do these great things. Very often, like the books that I was reading, the picture books at the time, they would have like, about the planets, right? About space. It's like a book about space, for like a 10-year-old kid or an 8-year-old kid or something like that. I was probably reading it when I was 4, but ha ha ha. No, you had the book, about space, and it would go through like, the Earth is like this, and there'd be some cutaway, and it would show, the magma and things, and it's like, and then there's other planets in the solar system, and the sun is like this, and then you get to bigger and bigger things and galaxies, and then they start talking about more speculative things, and there'd be like one page about black holes, and it was this terrifying object where you're like, what is this thing? And they're like, very little is known about black holes because no one has ever traveled to one yet. And you're like, whoa, I got it. What's like, but it's a place where gravity is completely, it's a completely gravitationally collapsed object. And I'm like, what does that mean? And it sucks in anything that gets too close to it. You're like, whoa. So, and that's fascinating, right? I mean, this is exactly the thing where like it's saying on the page, there's something we have observed. We don't know what it is yet. That's so wonderful. And that's how, of course, as you know, that's what science does. We love these spaces of ambiguity, spaces of unknown things where we want to dive in to try to find an answer. And that's what physics is. Especially physics is wonderful because I don't really agree with who was it, Rutherford or somebody else who said, all of the science is either physics or stamp collecting, whatever that was. I don't agree with that. I think the other sciences, of course, are really fantastic, but physics definitely is the one, where you reach this very edge of our knowledge, and you're just like, oh, okay. And so you're not like really interested in just describing how things happen. You're looking for a search for mechanisms as to explain how and why different phenomena occur. So that's really what physics is, and that's supremely satisfying, supremely wonderful. And we love these ambiguous places, and we maybe on a personal level, each individual scientist, physicist is a person, right? So we have desires, and of course it's fun to discover something, it's fun to be right? But really, at the end of the day, rationally, intellectually that we're all searching for the same thing. And in fact, this can be a very long slog. This can be I like to say that my field, especially the experimental part, because these are such enormous experiments that take a long time to plan and execute. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And so if somebody's, if I, an acquaintance I haven't seen for like a year or something like that, I see them again. It's like, oh yeah, what's new? It's like, oh yeah, so what are the new discoveries at CERN? I'm like, I haven't seen you for only 1 year. You think we're just like we're a factory to churn out discoveries? That's not how science works. So.
Oh my God, there's so many things that I want to touch on everything that you've mentioned, but one concept I'm really interested to pick your brains on. Obviously, as you've mentioned, the physicist brain and the science brain works in a way, as you mentioned, that you want to always go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And how do you? I'm just interested to hear, how do you perceive the idea that you're always striving to get that knowledge, and you're always curious to know what is happening, for example, in the black hole, or what is happening in another, space phenomenon that you're interested in. But how do you deal with the idea that you might not be able to reach that knowledge? Because for me personally, once I got fascinated with astrophysics and space and so on, it's almost devastating for me to know that I might never receive the answers that I want to receive. So I'm dying to see, to know what is happening in space, and to know, how big we are, and to know all the things that I don't even know that I don't know. It doesn't make sense. So how is your brain perceiving that? Considering all the knowledge that you have, and that this is pretty much a life mission that you might not be able to go to, to get as an end goal to.
Well, if you're asking, how do I deal with, or how do I process the fact that there will definitely be incredible discoveries made after I'm dead, and I might not be able to understand. I probably will not be alive when certain things are discovered. Maybe that's what you're asking.
This as well, and just in general, how do you find motivation to work towards something that that you might not be able to understand? Yeah.
Oh, so you mean, so for example, how do you, how do I deal with the notion that, we do a lot of science, but that science doesn't necessarily guarantee a discovery or an answer to the question?
Yeah, this as well. In general, for example, you're dying to know what's inside in a black hole, and you're working towards that. But
Yeah.
you know that you might never, understand that. And I'm just interested how this notion affects your motivation and your perceptions and your general involvement into this process.
I don't know. I think it's kind of a mindset thing, to be honest. It's more, yeah. If I understand you correctly, if I understand your question correctly, it's more, we do the kind of research that we do because, again, science is a process. It's not actually a list of facts. It's not a list of answers, right? And so, even though I said that it's the best method that we humans have for determining truth from falsehood, and coming up with the current best understanding of the universe, which again is the stuff that we refer to as truth, scientific truth. But of course, that truth is always malleable, right? It's always changeable. It's always updatable, right? That's the other huge difference between science, the scientific way of looking at the world, and other dogmatic ways of looking at the world. Science is always subject to scientific knowledge is always subject to update. Right. So again, for example, what we have here in one of the things that we study at the Large Hadron Collider and many other facilities around the globe is this thing called the Standard Model of Particle Physics. This is capital S, capital M. It's a really fantastic, mathematical model that if you know some fairly straightforward math, you can kind of turn the crank, and this model will predict specific things that you should see in particle collision experiments if you perform them. And they're basically all been found. And the Higgs boson was the last predicted discovery of this thing. So it's a very successful model of the universe. But we know for a fact that it has to be incomplete because it does not explain. It really explains well basically everything around you that you interact with all day long, the kind of you and me matter and stars and planets and things like that. But that stuff only accounts for about 5% of the stuff budget of the universe. So there's 95% of the universe that we do not understand what it's made of right now. And so this standard model, quote unquote, we know it's incomplete. It's great. For all its successes, we know that it must be incomplete. It doesn't contain gravity, for example. We know gravity exists. It contains 3 of the 4 forces of nature, but not gravity. We also know that it doesn't contain dark matter. Dark matter is, we know for a fact that some phenomenon we refer to as dark matter exists because we see its effects on the cosmos due to gravity, but we have no idea what this particle is, if it is a particle. We've been looking for it for a very long time. So we know that the standard model has to be it's like this really great box that predicts things right here, but we know that it has to be extended at some point. And so these kinds of extensions are a lot of the things that we go to, we look for all the time. And but this model that we have, right? If someone came along, so some people from outside might think, oh, this is a very, it's like, oh, you believe in this model. Again, no, we don't believe in this model. It's just the current best description that we have. And if someone came along, in fact, with a completely different model that had nothing to do with this, notion of quantum fields and particles and things, if they came around with a new model that explained the same set of phenomena that the standard model did, plus it also explained these other things, it might take some time, but this one would win. This would take over and the other one would be abandoned. I would happily abandon the standard model if somebody else came up with another thing. So again, we're not emotionally invested in these things. Science is a process by which we ask and answer questions about the universe. And so, the type of research that we do here, and a lot of science around the globe, is done with this sense that we are all part of this process of inquiry. And every paper that we publish, and in fact, the vast majority of the papers that we publish here at CERN, currently work on an experiment called Atlas, one of the two experiments, these enormous experiments of the Large Hadron Collider that discovered the Higgs boson particle. And Atlas still runs now, and it's going to run for 20 more years, taking data with the Large Hadron Collider. And we publish papers all the time, and the vast majority of these papers, they say, if you look at them from one perspective, they are actually saying, we did not discover a new particle, frowny face, right? That's what they're saying from one perspective. From a different perspective, what that paper is saying is, we looked for the first time ever, the first time in human history, we looked in this corner, this little subset of our huge data set, to see if there was a new discovery there, because we didn't know, and we can confirm that there is no discovery there. So that's a huge success. All the papers that we publish are enormous successes for the scientific method, because they're new information about the universe that we did not have before. It's not up to us where the new discovery can be hiding. It's, in fact, so this is the sort of long version of answering your question. I guess the short version would be to say that, in fact, my job is not to make new discoveries. That is not my job. My job is not to try to discover, to make new discoveries. My job is to rule out all the possible places in our data set where a new discovery could be hiding. And that's it takes a subtle shift of what your mindset is, right? And so from that perspective, we're more like cartographers. We're more like, I'm more like a map maker than anything. And so, again, we have this enormous data set, this collision data that comes in, and we take a snapshot of all the stuff that flies out from the collision. And then we write all this collision data to disk, and then we analyze it afterwards, looking for things like dark matter. And it's a huge multifaceted data set. And there's, thousands of different, completely separate places within the data where you can look for new discoveries. And so that's what we do. And once you understand that that's the actual name of the game, maybe as a university student, you got to the classes and you're like, oh, wow, people work at CERN. Wow, they could discover a new particle. I'm going to get into that so I can discover dark matter. Unfortunately, that's not the right mindset. I mean, it's great. And I think that's nice that people have that same kind of attitude. And of course, I'm sure I went through that same time period as well, or that period where I had the same kind of attitude. But once you start to get into the research itself, you realize that doing science is its own reward. Like, it actually doesn't matter if you discover something or not. Maybe it matters for, I don't know, funding bodies, or, if you want to look cool for your friends because you have a Nobel Prize and they don't, it's like, okay, that's great. But I mean, keep in mind that, these kinds of totems, these sort of like symbols of success in science that we hold up, they're actually kind of antiquated, and we probably shouldn't focus on them too much. Like, I've said this many times, abolish the Nobel Prize, because it does a disservice to our field and the fields of the scientific, the scientific method, the scientific inquiry in general, because it still sort of underscores this notion that science progresses by a lone, normally a lone white male going, Eureka, I've changed everything myself. It's like, that's not how science works. We know that's not how science works. It's a collaborative process. It's collective. It takes what came before it and it builds upon it. So every discovery that happens in science relies upon the community of people that were supporting the conditions that led to that discovery. And it also relies upon all the people that came in the past to lay the groundwork for that discovery, even, and sometimes especially if the previous generations published results that were reporting no new discovery. Those can be as, those can be just as inspiring as the, we discovered something new papers. So, if that's, again, this is the long version. I do this a lot. The long version of answering the question is that, you kind of have to change your mindset. You do have your mindset changed as a scientist once you go through, especially grad school. You're like, okay, I sort of had it wrong in my head. It's like, you don't get into science to discover something. You get into science because science is amazing. It is its own reward. It's such a joy and a treat to be able to do science, to go through the hard work of the coding and the programming and the working with students and, trying to find, I don't have to do this a lot myself, but trying to find funding for your projects. This is the way the sausage is made. And the joy comes from the day-to-day recognition that I have had, even for a small amount of time and on a cosmic scale, all of our lifetimes are complete negligible blip on the cosmic time scale. I have had the grand good fortune to have a few years, of being able to participate in this wheel of science, this wonderful wheel of scientific inquiry. So I don't know if that answers your question, but this is the way that I think about it. It takes more of a mindset shift, right? It's not so much because it's like, oh no, I didn't discover something, my career is a failure. Nobody really feels that, at least when you're a scientist, a working scientist.
I think it's a beautiful way to, it's a beautiful idea because it really emphasizes the significance of the process rather than the strive for end result, which I think it's a great way in general to approach life in general, I guess.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned, the importance of, not being too emotionally invested in what you do and just sort of, being the observer of the process.
Yes.
And another, big thing that I would love to discuss with you is in terms of, the interconnection between the human perception and, this sort of, the gratifying idea in the human society about purpose and about the significance of our existence, and the connection of all of this with, the general fabric of the universe. And, this is the idea that greatly fascinated me. I got introduced to by it, for Brian Greene, and this is what really made me interested in this field. So you, as a person with amazing and great knowledge in terms of the universe and how it's constructed and how we are all constructed, I'm so curious to hear how this knowledge and this understanding shapes your perception in terms of the notion of human existence, and what are your ideas and personal beliefs in terms of whether there is a purpose behind who we are, or the general big question that we're all asking ourselves.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah.
First of all, I have to agree with you, and I probably would not be a physicist if it were not for Brian Greene's book, The Elegant Universe.
Yes.
So that was highly influential on me as well. So solidarity for all those people. Yeah, Brian's a great guy, and so in terms of the question though, it's like, I don't know. Anytime we start, because again, I have this sort of like second career as a second life as a public facing scientist, where I do these kind of performative monologues on stage, science storytelling, but then I also do a lot of I love to do these I love Q&As. I love Ask Me Anything format. That's like my favorite thing in the world. I had a TikTok account for like, I don't know, 6 months or something. Built up a rather large number of followers in a short amount of time. And one of the things that I've stopped using the account for various reasons, but one of the things that I loved about that format was that I could just do these kind of live streams, right? I could just, anywhere I was in the world, because I travel a lot for speaking engagements, anywhere I was with something cool behind me, I could like start doing a live, and tens of thousands of people would join asking questions about science. And we'd spend, an hour just talking. And I really liked the Ask Me Anything format. But so I do get asked to talk about these kinds of things with various people, the kind of the notion of like human, what's the point of life, what's the point of existence, what's the is there a meaning to everything around us. This one's interesting to me because for a long time, I would try to say, it's like, you don't need meaning, it's like the meaning is what you create yourself, it's what we as humans create ourselves. But I've actually become a little bit more, I think, radical in my view in that perspective, in that direction, recently, is that I find it like, and I'm not saying you did this, it's just we all did this, it's because our brains, we evolved this way. I find it horribly like vain. I find it horribly hubristic that humans would think that there should be some concept of meaning that we should apply to our existence, like to the universe. Like that's crazy if you think about it from one perspective. From a scientific perspective, it's like, okay, yeah, it seems probable that there are other civilizations out in the universe, given the size of the universe. Again, the only thing we know, though, the thing that is known to us is that we have an observable universe that's about, what is it, 96 million light years in diameter or something like that, or billion, I think it is, like orders of magnitude. It's, we know that exists, but we know that there must be stuff outside that. And the size of the universe is, we don't know. It could be huge, 250 to at least 250 to 500 times larger than the observable universe, but it also could be infinite in size. We don't know that. And so if that's the case, if it is infinite, then okay, yeah, probably there have to be other, statistically there have to be other civilizations. But even if it's large, it seems, likely that there's other civilizations out there. There's no reason for us to think that we're somehow special in this universe. And because of that, it requires us to start thinking deeply about all of the kinds of human inventions, if you want to take it a different direction, human innovations, but human inventions, the concepts that we have invented to try to make sense of our existence in the universe. And one of those concepts is the fact that we need to have explanations for why so the concept that we have to have meaning, like you have to impose meaning upon something, which doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, from a cosmic scale, this makes no sense. Within human civilizations, yes, it does make sense, right? I mean, I like to think that my grandmother loved me because, she cared about me as a human being, because, we're related, but also just because she was a kind human being and she cared about, the goodwill of all humanity. That's good. There's a good meaning behind that. I like to think that, kindness is a good thing. And I espouse these views myself, that all humans are connected, all humans are equal, all humans are, should be equal. And we need to go out of our way to equitably distribute our resources to people that are less fortunate than ours, simply because they're humans and they deserve the dignity to live, right? These are within human societies. This is completely essential. But from a cosmic scale, like, why would we assume that the universe would care about our concepts of meaning? That's insane. Like, that's crazy. That's like psychotic to think that the universe is literally just this thing that exists that we're a part of. We invented this concept of meaning. We invented this concept of, I need to have some kind of emotional, I need to have some kind of emotional explanation for why something exists or why something happens or does not happen. Otherwise, I'm not satisfied. But the universe doesn't care about that at all. Like, I like to say, from one perspective, one of the things I love to say is that the universe is under no obligation to make its laws seem elegant to humans. And a corollary of that is that the universe is under no obligation to create the conditions so that humans can impose their psychological inventions upon parts of the universe that are not applicable. Those are not applicable to it all. Like that to me is just insane. And so, again, for some people that might seem like I'm evading the question, but I really do think that it's something that it doesn't make any sense to impose this kind of understanding upon things that, that the universe doesn't care about, right? And this is another version of. This is a more, like I said, a more kind of radical version of things that happen within science all the time. This is something that we've all talked about, we've all experienced in various ways. This notion that quantum mechanics is weird, right? This is what I use the words myself. Because I talk to the public a lot. I have to use shortcuts to kind of start the conversation. And it's true, from one perspective, quantum mechanics is weird because there are a lot of phenomena that happen down at the smallest possible scales in the universe that are counterintuitive to you and I, right? And that's just true because, for example, again, to be clear, particle physics is all about quantum mechanics, right? Because when you go down to the smallest possible thing, again, me as a child looking at the piece of bread and then get down to the crumb and you get to a molecule and you get to an atom and you get to the particles inside of an atom and an electron. An electron, I said, is zero volume. So your body is swarming with electrons right now. I said an electron has zero volume, but it can still carry quantities like charge and spin and energy and momentum. That's a bit weird, right? Part of this has to do with quantum mechanics, is that you have, from one perspective, you can model an electron as like a little chunk of something moving through space, like a little pebble, right, moving through space. And from some phenomena that I might want to describe, I can model it that way with the mathematics, and it works well. Other phenomena, that doesn't work at all, and I have to model it more as like a little wave packet moving through space, like a waving packet of probability. This is the sort of thing where it starts to reach the edge of our human intuitive understanding. And so this is why people say things like, quantum mechanics has weird stuff in it, and in quantum mechanics, again, we collide particles here at the Large Hadron Collider. When I collide two particles at nearly the speed of light, those particles can in fact cease to exist, and a new particle is created in their place, which lives for a tiny fraction of a second before this then disintegrating and turning into other particles. So when I say we collide protons at the Large Hadron Collider, the image you should have in your head is not that we're smacking the two protons together head on to see what's inside that's not what we're doing. What we're trying to do is get some of the individual particles like the quarks and the gluons close enough so that those things interact and overlap. And so once you understand that particles can be both little chunks of something, but also little wave packets, it starts to make more sense how this kind of like particles cease to exist and a new thing is created in their place can happen. I mean, it's not, because particle collisions are not like, but the key point here is that that's not intuitive to us as humans at all. It's counterintuitive, right? Because particle collisions are not like car collisions, because in car collisions, like for example, in our everyday world, it's like if two cars collide in the middle of the intersection, we're like, oh no, is everybody okay? Is Mary okay? And maybe this tire goes off to the side, and there's windshield is broken and some glass, but the pieces are all there, right? It's like Mary okay? Is John okay? Okay, everybody's okay. But before and after, you still have the two cars, right? But that's not the way it works at the particle level. So imagine a car collision where the two cars vanish upon impact and a bicycle appears in their place, and then the bicycle explodes into two skateboards that hit our detector. Please don't hit our detector with a skateboard. That's quite expensive. But this would never happen in the macroscopic world, in our world. But this kind of thing happens regularly at the quantum world, because again, you have to think of these more as like little wave packets, and you have two little wave packets that come together. They can actually overlap and constructively interfere. Again, this is a very kind of simplistic way of a kind of analogy to use, but it's a way to understand how this thing can actually happen. And again, the way those come together, we can't choose that. It's the universe already has these rules in place for whether or not we're going to create a new particle. Again, we can't choose it. We can only do it a huge number of times and see how often the universe likes to do this. So again, these things are completely counterintuitive to you and I. And there's a million other examples we get, as you already know, in quantum mechanics, right? Spooky action at a distance, entanglement, quantum tunneling, right? I mean, there's basically a zero probability that right now I will suddenly and spontaneously appear and be measured underneath the floor. But this kind of thing happens regularly in the quantum world. You can have a physical barrier and a particle held here, and you hold it there, and there's some probability that you'll actually measure the particle being on the other side, because this has it has a probability distribution governed by quantum mechanics as to where it could appear. So these things are weird. And again, you're going, whoa, I go, whoa, too, because, and every physicist and every human being does this, too, because, again, this kind of behavior is very counterintuitive to you and I. But again, it's insanely hubristic and vain. It's human vanity to think that the universe is under some obligation to make its laws seem elegant or intuitive to humans. Intuition is not magic either. Intuition comes from experience. It's built upon experience. A baby has no intuition about car collisions. This only comes later. And so intuition comes from experience, and we as a species, we didn't evolve at the quantum level, nor did we evolve at the enormously cosmic scale, right? To see like quasars blowing out stuff, or to be inundated with infrared radiation, and be affected by that, right? We evolved in this extremely friendly, friendly planet, this friendly energy range with this tiny sliver of atmosphere that's just the right temperature and everything, that we're completely destroying right now. The humans have chosen to do this, and we're choosing to continue to do this. And if we don't act, anyway. So, but like this is super friendly. Most of the universe is not like this, and there's no reason for us to think that the universe, like the laws that we learned, that the way that the universe works, there's no reason. It makes no sense to think that those laws that we learn should somehow seem intuitive to humans. So as a result of that, it's like that's why I think that it just doesn't make any sense to me anymore to think about why why does humanity exist? What's the meaning of it all? What's the, what's the point of everything? Well, these concepts, and I'm not being nihilistic. Okay, I'm kind of being nihilistic if you come from a
Yeah.
philosophical perspective. Yeah, this is sort of like, I used to call it, what is it called? Benevolent
Mhm.
nihilism, or
Mhm.
optimistic nihilism, something
Mhm.
like that. And this is, again, this is nothing magic. It's just basically making the simple observation that, oh, wait a minute, we humans have these five senses that our species has only had for its entire evolution. We have only had this set of inputs. And then we have, over the years, learned to use these tools that we have, these, our intellectual tools, the scientific tools, to start to design other types of implements or instruments and things that are extensions of our five senses, to learn things about the universe that we could never learn with just our five senses. And so once we do that, we start learning things about the universe. It's like, wow, wait a minute. All that means, all the basic thing is, the question that should arise there is not, wow, there's so much of the universe is impersonal. What's the meaning of life?
Mhm.
That's not the question that should even come up. The question that should come up is, wow, it's amazing how limited humans are, how
Yes.
limited we are. It's incredible how limited we are, but it's also fantastically cool and amazing that we can actually design implements to look at these things. Like the fact that we can design telescopes to see the hot gas swirling outside of black holes. That's incredible. The fact that we can build a 27-kilometer circular tunnel 100 meters out of the ground and collide protons together and collide protons together at such a rate to coax into existence this tiny little particle that then disintegrates. And this particle is proof positive that the universe is everywhere in the universe is permeated with this kind of invisible jelly called the Higgs field that results in certain particles of yours having this property known as mass, non-zero mass, which leads to the fact that we're even here to begin with to have this conversation. That's incredible. That in and of itself is, again, imposing meaning on things for me is very much is obviously essential for human societies. And again, it depends on the perspective you want to look at things, right? If you want to look at science from a purely science and philosophical lens, that's what I'm talking about. But you want to look at science through a political lens or an economic lens as well, then we need to sort of talk about these things and the concept of meaning and where things come from. But if you're just talking about science itself, there's nothing. And again, I think that, and I do it myself. Like I said, we've all done this because this is the way that our human brain evolved. This is the way humans evolved, to need to have explanations for things and like a meaning for something, right? But once you get to the point where our species is now, we need to eventually, I mean, it makes sense for us to jettison to abandon this concept, right? It's like, oh, okay. Well, it's like, what's the meaning of it all? Oh, wait a minute, that's the wrong question. The reality is the following: I exist right now, you exist right now, we exist in the society right now, which has incredible tools, which has developed incredible tools to learn amazing things about the universe. And the only, if we are, and we definitely are still there, right, as a species, if we need to impose meaning upon things, the meaning that we have, the meaning for human life, there is no ultimate meaning. The fact is that you and I, again, when you and I ask questions about the universe, in fact, you and I are, in a way, we're the method by which the universe asks questions about itself, because
Whoa.
we are parts of the universe. We're not separate from the universe. That's another perspective. That's another component of this whole discussion, right? Is that whenever we have this, this question, it's like, oh, well, what's the meaning of it all? It's like, it's sort of assuming that, it's like, what's the meaning of the universe? What's the purpose of life in the universe? And but built into that question, underneath it all, is this somehow separation. It's like, oh, well, yeah, it's humans versus the universe, and what does the universe do? No, that's crazy. Because, like I said, there's this, for example, there's this Higgs field that permeates all of space everywhere. It's kind of like an invisible jelly, and you don't feel it, but some of your particles do. As they move through, a little bit of their energy is dragged, and it's stuck into a point that we measure as mass. And mass is not the same word that you and I use colloquially, like, whoa, look at that massive building. Mass for a particle, again, an electron has zero volume, but it has mass. So it has nothing to do with bigness or size. It is this intrinsic property that's built in there based upon how much of it is dragged by this Higgs jelly, this Higgs field. But this concept of a field also is it's the underpinning of everything in particle physics. In fact, go back to what I was talking about earlier about this notion that if I have an electron moving through space, if I want to, from some perspective, I can model this accurately as a little chunk of something moving through nothing, like empty space, a little pebble moving through empty space. Okay, yeah, I can model it sometimes that way. From another perspective, though, that's not the most fundamental and accurate way to describe all of its phenomena. In fact, the most fundamental way to think of an electron, and by extension, all of the elementary particles around us, an electron moving through empty space is not what happens. Instead, what we need, the more fundamental and accurate way to think about it, is that an electron is a little vibration in a field, a quantum field that permeates all of space everywhere. So the fundamental structure of the universe are these quantum fields, and the particles are little temporary vibrations, fluctuations in this field. So imagine you're playing with your cat on a bed, right? And you pull the bed sheet tight and you put your finger underneath the sheet and you move your finger around and the cat chases this thing, right? It's like, oh, I'm chasing the thing. So if you take the sheet away and you just put your finger there, the cat's just like, leave me alone, and wouldn't bother. But once you put the field there, suddenly you have a thing. So that's what you can think of like electrons and particles as. And this is not just a heuristic. This is this thing I refer to as quantum field theory, right? The way that you learn physics as a student, you start with the kind of Newtonian style thing where I have like a rock and I throw it up. What's the equation that makes it do this thing that comes down to the earth due to gravity? And then later you learn more things that built on top of that, and eventually you get to, okay, really the basic fundamental way, the most elementary way to describe the universe is that it's permeated with quantum fields that have these vibrations in it. And the corollary of that is that literally you and I are all collections of particles that are vibrations in the exact same quantum fields. Wow. And if that's the sense, we're just embedded in the universe. We're not separate from the universe. So like, sitting on the rock, looking up at the stars, thinking, well, what's the purpose of everything? Which we've all done. I do this myself, or I have done this in the past. It's like, what's the purpose of life? Instead, maybe the question that we should ask when we're doing that is, how did I get so lucky to be one of the sperm and eggs that actually got together to be able to be here right now, to be able to look up at the universe and actually contemplate existence itself? How did I get that lucky? Wow. And the corollary of that question, of course, is, wait a minute, on a cosmic scale, the amount of time that I exist in this universe is basically nothing. It's negligible. And because of that, that time is precious. That time is like incredibly precious. Am I really going to spend my time on Earth in existence? This particular collection of this vibration of quantum fields and particles. Am I really going to spend my time like literally just trying to get a higher paycheck? Mm-hmm. Am I literally going to spend my time like getting suckered by far right political movements to tell me that someone brown skin is coming to take my job? Am I really going to spend my time to that, or am I going to spend my time and my resources, this precious time that I have, to make sure that others that are less fortunate than me also get a chance to ask questions about the universe just like I do? I'm very privileged to be able to say these things, to ask these things, right? So I don't know. That's the way that I think about it. Other people might think about it a different way.
Wow. I literally got mind blown a few times. That was absolutely amazing. And I was... I so wanted to ask you about that because from early ages, I was very much into philosophy, Albert Camus and Sartre. And obviously, the question about existence is very big there. And I remember you probably might have watched it, The Tree of Life by Terrence Malick,
yes.
the movie. And, it had this sort of an idea that the whole cosmos is sort of concentrating on, of each of one of us individually. And sort of this is a sense of purpose there. But after, going into the idea of, the general landscape of the cosmos and pretty much coming to the conclusion that you've just said, that it actually relieving that there is no purpose. It's actually beautiful that we're just here and we're just experiencing what we experience. I think it's a notion that completely can change your mentality and mindset towards living life. At least it did it to me. And hearing your elaborated version on that was even more eye-opening for me personally. So that was an absolutely amazing answer. And since you've mentioned that you're into, this sort of Q&A sort of things, I would love to ask you a few things myself, because I would love to hear your thoughts. So
Sure.
I've been struggling to visualize the idea of nothingness, you know,
Uh,
and obviously it all came to me. We know 30.8 billion years ago, the Big Bang, the universe happened, and so on and so on. So I've always been struggling to visualize what was it there before that, and I've been listening to Brian Greene about that, and Michio Kaku, and all of these, sort of Brian Cox, all of these physicists. And I would love to hear how you'd answer this question.
so you're asking how do we visualize what was before the Big Bang, or how do we visualize nothingness? Yeah. Well, I don't know what those guys would say, but the truth is that we don't know what was before the Big Bang, and it's a huge unanswered question. Some claim it's unanswerable. I would never go so far as to think that something is unanswerable, but I also don't really know how to, we don't really know how to answer this question. So it gets complex. It gets complicated by the fact that when you go back toward what we refer to as, I guess before the Big Bang, in fact, which was this inflationary period, right, which of the universe is like, again, actually, if you look at it closely, like when you refer to the Big Bang, really what we're talking about is, like, technically the Big Bang itself happened after the inflationary period happened, and that's what the Big Bang is. But then when you put these things together, we have this thing called inflationary Big Bang theory. So it's kind of like the whole thing at the moment of, the inflation, etc. So again, I personally don't know how to visualize what happened before the Big Bang, because again, this gets complicated by the fact that, because of our understanding of, like I said, things like quantum mechanics and quantum fields, when you get down to small enough length scales and time scales, and high enough energy scales, these are all equivalent, our current understanding of our current ability to describe things in a physically meaningful way breaks down. So, for example, if we ask the question, what was before t equals 0, some people claim that there's no such thing as t equals 0, because once you get down below something like 10 to the power minus, what's the Planck time, 10 to the power minus 42 seconds or something like that, I don't know, something like that, but something enormously small. Once you get down to that level, the concept of time doesn't make any sense anymore. We don't have any kind of time step that you can physically describe as smaller than that. So if that's the case, then you have to logically conclude that there's no such thing as t equals 0. And the expansion of the universe also followed as sort of like, it has sort of like been, I guess, eternal in a sense. But again, what this means is that it complicates our human understanding, to our human ability to describe such things. You know what I mean? So again, it's like, well, there's no intuitive understanding of this, because it might actually be beyond our current understanding of the universe. So maybe this seems like it's also evading the question, but this is just the kind of starting point to say that it might not be possible for us to really answer this question with our current understanding of the universe, right? So if quantum field theory is real, and it seems to be the way the universe works, and if our understanding of the Planck time and the Planck length are real, then we really can't say anything physically meaningful about times and length scales that are below those things, and above energy scales like that. However, people start to go into more speculative territory, and they kind of like assume that, okay, they sort of say, okay, well, assuming that, because this is true, right? I mean, we know that, for example, we also don't know what's in the middle of a black hole, right? And behind all of this, behind a lot of the discussion that we're having, and the discussion that people have about physics in general, the kind of ultimate edges of physics right now, is the question as to how gravity and quantum mechanics work together, which we currently don't know how this works. These work together. Maybe they don't, but that would be very dissatisfying to physicists. We like to have these mechanisms and explanations for how and why things happen the way they do. But the current place in the universe where these two theories come together, we suspect that they came together at some point back, far back toward the moment of the Big Bang. There was some kind of quantum gravity that existed. And the current place where these two things come together is in the center of a black hole, right? Because if you look at the equations of a black hole, it implies that at the center of the black hole, there's something called a singularity, which would be, some certain amount of mass within at the zero volume or something, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, it mathematically makes no sense to have like a singularity. And so it's likely that the universe doesn't use singularities, which means that there's probably, and in fact, inevitably, there's some new kind of physical understanding that will step in both inside of a black hole and also back toward the moment of the Big Bang that we currently don't know what it is, those things could step in. And then eventually that will provide the piece that will allow us to understand, how to define what's before the Big Bang, or, what was T equals 0, or, what's in the middle of a black hole. So again, I'm taking the very, by contrast to the other people you talked about, right? I'm an experimentalist, right?
Yeah.
I guess Brian Cox started as an experimentalist too, but like, at the end of the day, I think that all these ideas are great. Again, we can talk about multiverse theory. We can talk about, infinite expansion, inflation. We can talk about all these kinds of things. But at the end of the day, I'm an experimentalist and I need some kind of evidence, right? I need somebody to show me. I think that, we talked about earlier, you try not to get emotionally involved in any of your particular experiment or your theory, but, we're also humans, right? I mean, if my theorist colleagues have like a set of math that's really elegant, that makes sense that they would get emotionally involved. And that's like, wow, this is really nice, right? Like string theory. String theory, again, Brian Greene is a good example. We talked about Elegant Universe earlier, right? It's like string theory is fantastically interesting, right? I mean, it's been mathematically very successful, and it does provide a really nice mechanism, a nice explanation for how gravity and quantum mechanics could work together. We currently have, and it's in principle, it's testable, but we currently have no perceivable way of building a machine that would reach energies high enough to be able to test string theory directly. So as a result, it kind of like string theory has reached this realm of like this thing that's a really, really, really good idea that we can't test in the foreseeable future. That, of course, brings it, it gives it even more of a mystique for some people. They're like, whoa, well, it must be real because we can't get to it right now. It's like, okay, that's not the way science works. Again, as an experimentalist, I always have to go back to this. I need to experiment at some point to demonstrate this. But the speculative theories, I still think they're scientific. So, for example, if somebody, multiverse theory is a good example, right?
Yeah.
So if we, one of the ways that you might start to think about or visualize, what was before the Big Bang, you might think of some sort of like multiverse landscape of constantly inflating bubble universes that are constantly popping into existence in this enormous landscape of stuff. But when I say landscape, what does that even mean, right? Okay, what it sort of assumes that this landscape or these other universes, okay, they have to have something in common, right? They just can't be totally and completely different, right? I mean, for us to even postulate the existence of these other universes, you have to sort of assume that, okay, well, if there's a multiverse, it probably has some concept of space-time like ours does, because otherwise it makes no sense. Like it's just literally impossible to think about. Okay, so space-time exists in this landscape. Okay, that's fine. So then maybe these other universes also have space-time properties. Maybe you could squint and maybe like some of those properties are a little bit different from the ones that we have in our universe. But again, there's still going to be some shared notion of space-time. Maybe the dimensions of space are more. Maybe other people have tried to postulate the notions of like other dimensions of time. That doesn't make any sense to humans at all. So this is kind of a long version of saying that to try to visualize this is very hard. And for me, like I kind of like to think about the notion that we have this enormous landscape of possible universes in a possible multiverse. But what I'm saying is that this is a version where we have to sort of like, it again, what requires us to sort of change our brain and our mindset. Really what we're saying when someone says, multiverse theory is a possibility, they're kind of, in a sense, what we're doing is they're sort of changing what our attitude about the universe is, right? If you go back to the concept of the universe, even from a philosophical perspective, the universe was defined as everything that exists, everything that is in existence, right? Okay, so if we then postulate that we have this little bubble thing that we refer to as our universe, but then there could be other universes in a multiverse, well, that sort of expands the conception of everything that exists, right? So again, this is the long version of saying that this is hard for me to visualize.
Yeah.
And if I think about, but there's a real sort of visualization here that I find fascinating, is that, one of the, irrespective of, say, string theory or something like that, a lot of people are studying the notion that, one of the ways that our universe could have begun could have been as a seed, a sort of like a seed universe that branched off from another universe in the multiverse in a black hole in another universe.
Whoa.
And this sounds like science fiction that somebody would just write as a sort of weird thing that's sort of nonsense if you look into science, but this is entirely possible. And it comes from a lot of different perspectives. Number one, that we don't know what happens inside of the center of a black hole. Number two, the sort of, the kind of like interstellar version of like, Einstein-Rosen bridges, these wormholes. Yeah, these could exist. We don't have any evidence that they do yet, but the mathematics show that they could exist in principle. And the other part is that, if you look closely at black holes, if you look closely at the concept of a black hole, really, if you take Einstein's equation, where does a black hole come from, right? The prediction came before the observation, right? So this is fascinating. It's like this weird object that fell out of the equations. If you look closely at the equations, you can determine what it takes to make a black hole out of anything, right? So if I want to make a black hole out of the sun, it shows you take your favorite textbook on gravity. I assume you have a textbook on gravity and a bedside table like I do. And then you take that and you find the black hole equation, and it'll tell you how small of a volume you have to pack something in to make a black hole out of it. So to make a black hole out of the sun, we need to pack the entire sun into a volume that goes around like the center part of London. Okay. And to make a black hole out of the earth, we need to pack the entire earth into a volume that's about the size of a blueberry. And so to make a black hole out of you, we'd have to pack you all into a volume, I think, that's smaller than the radius of a proton or something like that. So, you're safe. But you can do this with larger things too. So if we want to make a black hole, like I said, we can do this with the sun. We can do this with with the solar system. We can do these other things. What if we wanted to make a black hole out of the observable universe? So you can do this calculation yourself. If I take all the stuff within the observable universe, and my astronomer colleagues are very good at estimating the amount of stuff in the observable universe, all the particles and all the dark matter and everything like that, and they're very good at estimating this. And you get a number, it's some enormously large number. Then you put that number into the equation that tells you how small of a volume you have to pack it in to make a black hole. That volume is already larger than the current observable universe.
Whoa. Okay.
And so you start thinking, okay, well, maybe they got the mass wrong, right? Okay, maybe, astrophysics has, lots of error bars on, the numbers from astrophysics, right? Okay, so maybe they got the number wrong by half, right? And that's a huge error. So, okay, let's take it by half. You're still the universe. To make a black hole out of the observable universe, you'd still need to pack it into a volume that's already larger than the observable universe, which raises the question, do we live inside an enormous black hole? And this is bizarre. It doesn't make any sense, right? Because like we think about the science fiction versions of black holes, it's like, this enormous object that's sucking in everything. And, when you go inside, you have this like light show, and then you show up behind your daughter's bookshelf and you give her Morse code or something like that, right? It's like, okay, that's what we think of as black holes. But a black hole, if you have a large enough black hole, in fact, if you cross the event horizon, you wouldn't even notice anything had happened. In fact, if you have a large enough black hole, you could be inside the black hole and not really notice for a very long time. And so if you apply this to the black hole the concept that we might live in a black hole, in an enormous black hole, you start to see how this could be possible. So for example, if I have a large enough black hole and in my spaceship, if I cross over the event horizon, what would my experience be?
Yeah.
So inside of a black hole, inside the event horizon, what my experience would be is that I would have this sort of like horizon. There would be an edge of there'd be an edge of my observable my existence that is right there, and it's always getting slightly larger because more things are coming into my view, right? Because I'm stuck in this black hole. There's this thing called the event horizon, which is sort of like the point of no return, and it's other things are slowly falling into the black hole, and so I can see them as they come in, but there's this edge beyond which I can't see anything. And I also no matter how quickly I were to travel, I would never be able to get there, because inside of a black hole, space is flowing into the center of the black hole faster than the speed of light compared to some perspective outside of the black hole. That's what it means to have a black hole. Space itself has sort of like a stuffness. It can flow and it can bend, as we know from general relativity. So that's what the experience would be like inside of a black hole. Now, what's the experience of us here on Spaceship Earth, right? We have a horizon. This is the edge of the observable universe that we can observe with our telescopes, beyond which we know stuff must be there, we can't see it, and it's slowly things are coming into our view as the light that came, that, you know, as the light that is out from those things outside of there has finally had time to reach us. So this horizon is slowly getting larger, and more things are coming in. But no matter how fast we ever travel, there's no way that we could ever get there, because, as you know, space is expanding, the universe is expanding, and as you get farther away from us, the faster it's expanding. There's no way for us to ever get to the edge of the observable universe. As a result, okay, it's possible that our entire universe is inside an enormous black hole.
Wow.
So that means if you want to start to, one way, again, I'm not saying this is just speculation, right? Because at the end of the day, we need a test. We need some experiment to test this, to test this hypothesis. But one way you could envision what it would be like before the Big Bang in our Earth is that if you postulate that our entire universe was birthed from a little seed of a Big Bang that was inside of a Big Bang seed that was birthed from a black hole in another universe, or another universe in the multiverse, then you can start to visualize a bit how that would be. But the visualization part breaks down too, because again, then we still currently don't know what's at the center of a black hole. We don't know what we don't know how the universe evades these singularities and how to visualize that. And we also don't know what it means for these things to exist. If you're talking about the inflationary Big Bang theory itself, then that's a different beast, right? Because we know that the universe, the notion that the universe is expanding comes from the fact that we see it, we observe this right now, and everything is moving apart from everything else in all directions. And this means that if you just go backwards in time, if you run the YouTube slider of the universe backwards, eventually everything had to be packed into a tiny dense little point that then started expanding. We know that right before inflation, you had something tiny small, and then this thing, the expansion of the universe, as you know, didn't just go in kind of like a gradual way, like someone really controlled blowing up a balloon really slowly, right? It didn't happen at all. It had these weird epics. Like the first expansion of the universe was really fast. It's called inflation, right? It's like pow, and then it slowed down, and it went at a sort of gradual rate for billions of years, fairly gradual rate. And then a few billion years ago from us now, it started to speed up. So we call these epochs or epochs of expansion. It had this crazy expansion, then a kind of slow one, and then a few billion years ago, it started to accelerate it again. And this is the thing that we see happening right now. So if you want to visualize that, that's okay. That's hard. That's easier to visualize because you just kind of squint your eyes, and it's like I have this little thing that was packed, and then it started to expand, and then it kind of slowed down and went like this. But before the Big Bang, I don't know. And if these other guys are describing what's before the Big Bang, then they're truly into speculative territory here.
Wow. Oh my God. Yeah, I'm geeking out here a bit, so sorry about that, but this is just so fascinating to hear. Okay then, so by the way, just before moving to my next question, do you have any time? Do you like?
Yeah, we're getting to 3:30. I should probably go in the next, I don't know, 10 minutes or something.
Okay, so 10 minutes. Okay, so I'll give you another space question after that. I really want to talk about your filmmaking and your opinion on this field as well. And another question that I have, and I guess you sort of touch on it as well, but it's the big question that I see quite a lot in this field. If the universe is limitless, how it is ever expanding? That's something that I can wrap my around as well. Because it's this sort of conundrum. If it's everything there is, how it is expanding.
Yeah, well, so this one you can think of the expansion again, when we talk about the expansion of the universe, keep in mind what we mean by expanding, right? Okay. So what is expanding? Like, how is it possible that, like I said, like we're, and earlier, this kind of touches upon the thing we talked about earlier, is like the sort of flip side of what we were talking about, this notion that it's very vain for humans to try to impose meaning upon things, that when meaning is a human invention. Each individual, by contrast, it's also completely accurate, and each individual human has the right to consider themselves the center of the universe, because we all have the right to consider that. By my physical point here, my observable universe will be this sphere that stretches out in all directions, and yours will be slightly different from mine. So we each have our own sort of like, barely imperceptibly different observable universe on us, and at which we are the center. And so what we're saying when the universe is expanding is that, everything is moving apart from each other in all directions. So like the galaxy that's far away from us is moving away from us. But what happened to make it move away? Like, did something come along and like flick it, like push it apart with his finger or something like that? Or like someone came and hit it with a baseball bat or something? That's not what happened. So what we're saying when we say that the space is, the universe is expanding, we're saying the space itself is being stretched. Because space itself, you kind of have to, again, we have to change our brains. So Einstein with general relativity really hit upon this notion that space itself, it doesn't have substance in the sense of, like the luminiferous ether or something like that, but it does have stuffness in the sense that it can flow and it can bend. We know this is the case. And in fact, we know it's measurable that space is, the phenomenon of gravity, in fact, is a force. It's accurate to refer to as a force, but the force doesn't arise from the same mechanisms as the other three forces of nature. The other three forces of nature arise due to these, quantum exchange of particles effects. Gravity, the force of gravity arises due to the curvature of space itself, right? So again, the reason why the Earth and the Moon orbit each other due to gravity is that the Earth is creating a little sinkhole in space itself, and then the Moon is sort of constantly falling toward the Earth. And so that's, that, imagine, again, the standard analogy is the big rubber sheet, right? If we stretch the rubber sheet flat and I take a marble and I go like that, if I go like that and hit the marble, it goes in a straight line, right? But if I put a bowling ball in the middle, it deforms the sheet. I hit the marble and it curves as it goes around the side of the bowling ball. So we know that space can bend. We also know that space can flow. If you get to extreme enough gravitational situations or conditions, space has like a flowing capacity, like we said in this black hole. The reason why we say light can't escape from a black hole is not, again, it's not like a magic object. What it means is that this is such a gravitationally collapsed object, so much gravity there, that as you're getting closer to this object, space is flowing inward faster. You get to this point of no return. Space is flowing inward faster than the speed of light. So if a light, beam is going this way, but space is flowing faster than it, it's never going to be able to get out of there, right?
Wow.
So this is what we mean. So space itself has a stuffness to it that means that it can bend and flow. So that as a result of that, it's a better, as a consequence, we can think about the expansion of space, the expansion of the universe in a better way. What really is happening is that the fabric of space is being stretched. Now, what's causing that stretching right now, and in fact, the accelerated stretching, that's an open question, this thing known as dark energy. And again, the word dark is not something mysterious. It's just that it doesn't interact via light. It's not a light-based thing. And it's also something we don't understand right now. So it's this kind of dark energy that is somehow pushing apart the fabric of space. So as a result of that, the Big Bang, again, nothing happened. There was no bang. There was no sound, obviously. And it's also, this notion of like, you can also ask the question, where did the Big Bang happen, right? If our universe was enormous, where did the Big Bang happen? Well, it happened everywhere because, again, space started to expand. So you can think about, when I say that we run the YouTube slider of the universe backwards, imagine like in your head, it's like all the galaxies are getting closer and closer together, and then everything gets packed into a tiny, tiny dense point. But really what you should be thinking about instead is that as you're going backwards in time, the fabric of space itself is stretching like a rubber sheet, and it's like three-dimensional rubber sheet, which the analogy breaks down. But then if you go backwards, the fabric of space starts to contract and get closer and closer together. And at some point, that's where that's this sort of like the tiniest possible thing before inflation, right? Was the entirety of the grid, the metric grid of the universe was packed into something really, really small, and all this stuff in the universe was packed in there too. And then that grid started to expand. The fabric of space itself started to expand. That's what inflation is, and that's what the expansion of the universe is. So when you think of it from that perspective instead. What was your question originally?
How the universe can be limitless, but it can be ever expanding.
Yeah. So I think that's the answer. So it's like, and to be clear, it's actually an open question as to whether the universe is limitless, so to speak. The size of the universe, we don't know. We actually don't know the answer to that question. It could be a finite object. In fact, the universe could have a finite size. that we don't know what that size is. It also could be infinite in size. And if that's the case, then it starts to get, then we start to get really weird about like, what does it mean to pack an infinite sort of space into something that was small and then expanded? Okay, this is where, I think sometimes these notions of multiverse landscapes come in handy, right? Because you can imagine that the infinity of the sort of landscape existed and ours was sort of like a little bubble, that kind of like a wrinkle that popped into existence inside this enormous landscape. But yeah, I think that mostly answers your question. I don't know.
Definitely. And another really quick one. Obviously, you've touched on, the fabric of space and the way that the masses of the different, objects, they're bending. And, we've all seen these sort of graphics where it shows how the different masses of the planets and the black holes, obviously the bigger the mass, the bigger the bend it does.
Yeah.
And it might be an irrational question, but it's just the way I visualize it. So I'll be interested to hear your thoughts in terms of, if this is the fabric and if the objects are here and they bend it, like, is there anything on the other side of the fabric? If this makes sense.
No, because again, these are all analogy, or these are like these are visual analogies, right? So again, you have to sort of think, and this is another limitation of our human, our human apparatus, right? Again, our human machine, it's a limitation there. We're very, very limited machines in the universe, by the way. As you know, right? It's like, I mean, for example, again, going back to one of the other questions that one of the things we touched upon earlier, right? This notion that, there's a lot of people with dogmatic belief systems toward existence, right? And they're like, a deity created everything because look how perfect, it's like, someone of course had to create this. Look how beautiful things are. Look how, for example, take the human eye. Think about how perfect the human eye is. It could never evolve on its own. That's crazy. The human eye is terrible. Like, it's on cosmic scales, the human eye is a terrible experimental apparatus because it can only see electromagnetic things in the electromagnetic spectrum between 400 and 700 nanometers. But the universe has an electromagnetic spectrum with frequencies that are far, far beyond all of those things. And our eyes can't see the muons coming in from outer space. It can't see the 65 billion neutrinos coming from the sun that are going through my thumb every second. So, again, our eyes are very bad from cosmic perspectives. And they're also, so our human devices, our human machines are very limited from that perspective. And it also breaks down when we start to have these analogies, right? When we're like, okay, so what does it mean for the Earth to create a sinkhole in space? Well, it's actually a three-dimensional sinkhole, which is really hard to visualize, right? So there's nothing, if we did live in a two-dimensional universe, right, and the rubber sheet was everything that existed, then it would be easier to somehow, like, even that would be hard, right? Because you'd have to have a two-dimensional thing. Again, the sinkhole analogy is really just like a heuristic to try to understand or try to visualize what it is. But then you have to always with the understanding that this is happening in all directions at once. So you have this two-dimensional deformation. You also have the third dimension deformation. There are I've seen a few people try to visualize this with various graphics that then show it, and they're okay. They do the best they can, but I think it's something that to a certain extent defies human visualization. So what's on the other side of the deformation is, nothing. There is no other side. It's just the three dimension. We're all embedded in the same three dimensions.
I see. This
one way to think about it is a better way to think about it is not just a rubber sheet, but it's the one that's like the rubber sheet that has a grid of lines on it, right? And there's a grid of lines without the bowling ball, right? We have the rubber sheet, and you put like like just a regular grid paper lines, like white lines, right? And you see these. What these means, and this is important because within general relativity, when you have some object that's moving through space, it has to follow like a straight line. And so, which makes sense, right? If I have this sheet and I flick the marble, it has to go in a straight line. There's nothing to prevent it from moving. Maybe this goes back to to Newton, right? There's in the absence of some kind of deviating force, it's going to go in a straight line. This is the same way with general relativity. But then once you put and it's the same way, even if we put a bowling ball in the middle of the rubber sheet too, that marble is in fact going in a straight line from its perspective. There's nothing for it, no other marble came along to hit it. So it's going in a straight line. But from our perspective, we can see that the straight line is being bent because you have an enormous bowling ball there, and the straight line is bent a bit. So that this maybe can help understand how it is that, if you extend this to 3 dimensions, then suddenly you can say, okay, the thing that I think is straight is actually, so straightness is relative in general relativity. And in fact, they have fancy names for these in the equations of general relativity and the tensor calculus that they use. These sort of, the fact that basis vectors, this is another mind-blowing thing for those of you that know some mathematics, the basis vectors can actually change as they move through space. That's a tough one for math people.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, okay, this was very helpful, very interesting too. So, just to finish off, because I want to touch on that, although, I can ask you questions for a week probably. But tell me a bit more about your filmmaking in terms of the projects that you are, you're interested in working on, gives you, the most pleasure to work on, and just in general, what's your connection with this sort of art form, as you've mentioned?
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, so the films that I do are kind of expressionistic explorations of different human, capacities or different human endeavors, like psychological, political, emotional. And so they're more sort of, I like to do like, installations and kind of site-specific installations for films. So last year, for example, I did an installation in an art center in a place called Arbonne, Switzerland. So it's called the Kunsthalle Arbonne. And there was a room there that I did an installation specifically for. So I shot a film that I shot in several locations around the world, a bit in New York, a bit in Estonia, a bit around CERN. And this kind of came together. And the thing that I edited together, the main projection was almost like more like a visual poem than anything. So it's kind of like different city streets and how these things come together, and it sort of builds in a kind of visual narrative, but not a traditional narrative, but a sort of visual narrative. And there were some other channel films that I put on the wall as well in this little room. And so these are films that are exploring, for me, I was trying to explore themes of loss and human meaning, right? Because these are the concept of human meaning is completely valid for art and for psychology and for emotion and for the humanities especially. And so, that's the kind of thing that I like to do. I'm also really interested in humanity's relationship to technology, right? As a scientist myself, and as a person who deals with a lot of, I don't know if I would call myself a futurist per se, but I'm a person that is very interested in technology and the future of technology and how, what is humanity's evolving relationship with technology. And so I like to explore this too from a more visual perspective. I haven't really gotten into I've done a little bit with, sort of like AI based things, but nothing really, it's not really that interesting to me. I'm more sort of an old school filmmaker where I like to use the, framing and montage to have the weight of the meaning rather than, sometimes gimmicks or tricks that are sort of like AI based or something like that. Again, there's some great art that's being made with those tools, but it's not really the thing that I do. So yeah, I don't know. It's a long way of saying that I like to do these sorts of visual poems, visual impressionistic or expressionistic, depending upon the perspective, examinations of a lot of different types of human emotions. It's hard for me to describe. I mean, without, it's like trying to describe a painting on a podcast, right? It's like, well, okay. kind of just have to see it yourself.
Yeah. Is there a specific place, where we can find your movies?
No, they're not really online. Like I said, they're sort of site-specific installations, and then they wouldn't be anywhere else. If there are enough hours in the day, there's like a million projects that I'm working on. There's one big one that I'm working on that might get shot. Hopefully we'll shoot in 2024. And then there's a few other smaller pieces that I would love to put into a gallery show at some point. But again, I just have to find the time to make that happen. These would be sort of, I'm interested also in, because I used this TikTok account for a while. At first, as a filmmaker, right, the notion of shooting something special with, for the portrait mode was insane. I'm like, oh, I hate portrait mode as a filmmaker. But then I'm like, okay, how could I take this as a challenge? And I kind of started to get into this notion of, how can we use that in an artistic sense to challenge people's, or take advantage of a lot of people's expectation to interact with visual media from the portrait mode as well. So I like to, so I would love to, I have this sort of gallery show that I'd love to put together that has sort of like portrait mode films in very large screens, and kind of match together with some other pieces as well. But yeah, unfortunately, none of this stuff is really online. I don't really, there's a few stills that I put into some of my, I put a page on my website that I think is just jbbeacham.com/films. And I kind of just put like a list of some of the major ones that I've done over the years. And there's not that many, but it's something that there's a few more coming up.
Amazing. And
provided I can find enough time to do everything.
Yeah. And finally, I just love to hear that from you as well. What would you say are your main influences in terms of filmmakers or painters and even writers? I would love to hear the names and the sort of art that is influencing you and that has affected you.
That could be a very long list. So film, I don't know. Lots and lots of people have influenced me. Luis Buñuel, Ingmar Bergman, Martin Scorsese, Jean-Luc Godard,
yes.
Maya Deren, Tarkovsky, Fellini. There's a lot of people that have influenced me over the years, and hundreds of others. Stanley Kubrick, people like this. So that are really interested in the very meaty philosophical issues of their time, and also the larger philosophical issues of existence. I find myself drawn to those. I'm also drawn to a lot of movies that have a very clear, or at least a subtly clear, political attitude too, because I think it's, again, both science and art are inherently political, because everything is political, right? It's like, if someone says something is like, keep politics out of it, that's a political statement. And so it's important to, even science, the entire discussion we're having here, right? The undercurrent of it about all the scientific stuff is, and if a lot of the stuff that I talk about that I explore in art too is, what does, in this notion of humanity's relationship to technology, what does the research that we do in science, and these big projects like CERN, or, Human Genome Project, things like this, what do these say about our priorities as a society, and what kinds of questions could we ask to interrogate our priorities as a society, to see where they've gone wrong? I don't know, authors, that's a long list too. Yeah, like Camus, Sartre, and
nice.
Angela Davis, hugely influential on me. Dostoevsky. Let's see, who else? James Joyce. This is a tough one because there's so many writers. Marilyn Robinson.
The French connection there with Camus and Sartre is a huge story, so amazing.
But of course, Kafka is a huge influence on me, and I don't know that this could go a long distance. I just tell you what the most recent things that I've read. For example, I've read. I'm still in the process of reading The Dawn of Everything. The last book by David Graeber before he died, and his co-author is named David Wengro. This is fantastic because they're basically, throwing over this sort of this erroneous notion that we've been taught in schools about how human civilization progressed in one sort of like linear sense, right? It's like we started as hunter-gatherers, and then agriculture was invented by magic, and then that led that we had to, we could store food, and so we could live together. But then when you live together, you need laws, and that's led to things like this and democracy, and the Enlightenment was the perfect, and like so linear. That's nonsense. That's not how human civilizations progressed at all. They went in fits and starts. There's lots of examples from antiquity of societies that would experiment with different ways of living, right? There's nothing inevitable about the current version of capitalism that's dominant around the world. So this is a fascinating book. I just reread The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, and that's great. I read a biography of Marcel Duchamp by Calvin Tompkins, I believe. Anyway, so yeah, kind of all over the place. I recently finished the novel G by John Berger, which is really great. So amazing. I don't know. Painters, we could also go for a very long time. So let's.
Because I'm also very much into art, and you've mentioned a couple of things that got me to the idea where you're really into. I can imagine you're into like impressionism and Monet and Renoir and all of these guys.
But,
the classic.
But also contemporary art. I mean, I'm obsessed with people that are trying to expand the notion of painting to from not so much the sort of like zombie figuration stuff, but people like I like anybody else. I like a lot of the Gerhard Richter stuff, and I've been interested in a lot of other contemporary painters. I don't know.
Amazing.
There's a lot of people.
I can honestly, I guess I can do a whole another episode with you just for talking about this stuff. So
I'm looking at the time. I should probably go. I have some other things I need to do.
Thank you so much again. Thank you for your time. It was massive pleasure, and I'll keep you in touch with everything. Sorry about taking so much of your time. And
No, it's totally okay. It's I just have to keep an eye on the calendar because I'm on the time because I promised some other people some things. But it's totally okay. No problem.
Thank you so much. It was a massive pleasure, James. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Talk to you soon.